Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar, Safe Roads for Everyone, State Efforts to Protect Vulnerable Road Users. Hello, everyone. My name is Douglas Shinkle, and glad to have all of you here today. I am NCSL's Transportation Program Director, and I will be the moderator for today's discussion. This is the third webinar in the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee's annual spring webinar series. We've been holding this series for a number of years now. We've already held webinars this year on orphaned oil and gas wells and microgrids, respectively. And upcoming webinars will highlight school bus electrification, state policy options, and the benefits of wildlife infrastructure, respectively. So that will have a traffic safety bent to it as well, looking at some transportation infrastructure associated with wildlife conflicts. So for a complete schedule and registration details, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org or reach out to one of the staffers. I want to mention that this webinar is supported by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA. They've been a long-standing partner with NCSL on traffic safety issues. Their support enables us to track traffic safety legislation from all 50 states, and then produce research such as our annual traffic safety trends report, our legislative database. I also want to note that we will be holding a traffic safety pre-conference on Sunday, July 31st in Denver, immediately preceding our legislative summit, which will be taking place in Denver this year, which in Denver is our headquarters of NCSL. So we hope you can join us for that. There's not a registration fee for the pre-con. Of course, if you want to attend the larger legislative summit, there are registration costs associated. So just reach out if you have questions about that. And before I introduce speakers, I want to just kind of go over a couple of housekeeping items. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement. Over the next 60 minutes, we encourage participation through the chat box. So feel free to type your questions and answer questions in the chat box. And to begin building some comfortability with the chat function, and also to learn who is on the line today, I would ask you to type in the state that you're from in the chat box, and then we will hold a formal Q&A after our presenters are finished presenting. So our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website after the webinar is ended. Just hold tight for that. We will send out a notice once those resources are made available for everyone. So now that housekeeping is out of the way, let's get back to why we're here today. Safe roads for everyone, state efforts to protect vulnerable road users. With everything that's been going on with traffic safety and the increase in kind of dangerous driving trends, such as aggressive and excessive speeding, distracted driving, et cetera, the pandemic, we really saw an explosion of what was already really a troubling trends taking place across the country. There has been a steady rise in traffic deaths in the past decade, and pedestrians, bicyclists, and other vulnerable road users, such as wheelchair users, scooter riders, et cetera, are bearing the brunt of the increase in crashes and fatalities. Non-vehicle occupants now comprise 20% of all traffic deaths in the US, compared to 16% in 2011. So that's a pretty significant increase. Bicyclist deaths have increased from 623 nationally in 2010 to 846 in 2019. Pedestrian deaths have unfortunately skyrocketed in the past decade, going from 4,302 in 2010 to nearly 2,000 more, 6,205 in 2019. And traffic crashes are a leading cause of death for teenagers in America, and disproportionately impact people who are Black, American Indian, and live in rural communities. And some of those same populations are more reliant on biking and walking and scooters for their transportation without access groups tend to have less regular access to a vehicle. I do want to note that the United States Department of Transportation did release their National Roadway Safety Strategy, and that outlines the US DOT's comprehensive approach to significantly reduce serious injuries and deaths on our nation's highways, roads, and streets. The strategy does focus on 5 core objectives: safer people, safer roads, safer vehicles, safer speeds, and post-crash care. And on that point of post-crash care, NCSL's portfolio with NHTSA is extended into having a new EMS database, emergency medical services database, because that is a key part of traffic safety, is how the post-crash care. Meanwhile, legislatures have responded by taking a variety of actions, ranging from safe bicycle passing laws to enhanced penalties for injuring or killing vulnerable road users, to devoting more planning and funding resources for non-motorized transportation, such as complete streets policies and the incorporation of bicyclist and pedestrian facilities into maintenance and new construction projects. And so given all that, let's dive right into the discussion. Joining us today are Ken McLeod with the League of American Bicyclists and Barb Chamberlain with the Washington State DOT's Active Transportation Division. First up, we have Ken McLeod, and he's the policy director at the League of American Bicyclists, someone I've worked a lot with over the years and is always very helpful to me when I get complex or arcane bicycle questions. I know a lot about this stuff, but compared to Ken, I feel like I don't know very much. So happy to have him with us. The League of American Bicyclists is a national nonprofit bicycle advocacy organization, and it's dedicated to building a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. He leads the policy initiatives to improve bicyclist safety, manages their well-known bicycle-friendly state program, and provides technical assistance to people and groups working on state and local initiatives. Like I said, Ken knows probably more about bicycle state law than anyone in the country, so have some questions ready for him for sure. Let's see if we can stump him. And he will provide an overview. Critically, he's going to talk about the significant funding in the new Federal Infrastructure Act. He's going to talk a little bit about what's going on at the state level, but given everything in the IIJA or BIL, however you want to refer to it, there's a lot of new funding and a lot of new programs. And so Ken's going to go over some of that for us. And then Barb will have more of a state focus. And so with that, I think I'll turn it over to Ken. So I appreciate you joining us. And with that, Ken, I will stop sharing my screen and let you go, and appreciate it.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to join you today. And as you said, I do know plenty about state bike laws, but I am focusing on what our federal legislature said in the bipartisan infrastructure law, as the administration refers to it, or as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as the legislature might. So I am the policy director for the League of American Bicyclists. You can find me on Twitter at KenMCLD. And the League of American Bicyclists is a national nonprofit dedicated to building a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. We've been around since 1880 when we advocated for the paving of roadways. And everyone for us really means approaching things from achieving equity, which for us is the just and fair inclusion of everyone into society in which everyone can participate and prosper, creating conditions that allow all to reach their full potential. So when we look at federal funding, there's a lot of it in the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're talking about $52.5 billion this fiscal year, and bicycle and pedestrian facilities are eligible for 90% of that. So we're going to focus on 2 programs, the Transportation Alternatives Program and the Highway Safety Improvement Program. But bicycle and pedestrian facilities are eligible for the vast majority of federal funding. They've got this great tool, pedestrian and bicycle funding opportunities, on the FHW website. If you are ever hearing from your constituents or people in the state legislature that they can't use federal funding for biking and walking facilities, it's just not true. They absolutely can. When we look at how federal funding has been used for biking and walking facilities in the past, we see most of it coming from Transportation Alternatives and its predecessor program. That's the blue here. And we've seen in more recent years that funding streams from the federal level are diversifying, but safety, and we just heard from Doug that bicyclist pedestrian safety has really had a troublesome time over the last decade. That safety funding has not been finding its way to bicycle and pedestrian projects. So that's one of the reasons that Congress has made changes, and that's one of the reasons I'm going to talk about it today. So on transportation alternatives, the main source of federal funding for biking and walking projects, this program is really about funding smaller scale projects. What's really exciting for us as bicycle advocates is we get $7.2 billion in the next 5 years. That's about half of what's been spent on biking and walking since 1992. So it really is a large investment in a way we haven't seen before. But we also know it's not enough because based on annual reports required by Congress, there's a greater than $3 billion shortfall in fiscal year 2020 alone. So that shortfall is going to eat up that increased funding almost right away. And Congress is really saying that they want states to use this funding and implement it. We know there's a huge demand for bicycle and pedestrian facilities. We know there's a huge need. We aren't seeing all states use that funding well. And one of the ways that Congress has identified and changed its programming so that states can take better advantage of it is providing more funding that can go to staffing at the state level. So not just a bicycle pedestrian coordinator, but many more staff related to bicycle and pedestrian programming at the state DOT level. Our Bicycle Friendly States program, when we asked if there were bicycle and pedestrian staff at division offices, the most common answer was no division offices had bicycle and pedestrian staff. So 42% of states that answered that they didn't have bicycle and pedestrian staff at division offices. So as legislators, you can think about how you can support more staffing for biking and walking. Another thing that Congress identified is that some states are seeing that there's demand for these projects, seeing that there's a need, but still transferring money to other programs. So Congress made it very difficult to transfer money out of transportation alternatives. And the guidance that recently came out has said that it's going to be very difficult to transfer away from transportation alternatives. But it did highlight many programs, basically all programs that can fund biking and walking projects can be transferred to transportation alternatives. So if you want to make a big impact, there is more than enough federal funding that can go through this transportation alternatives program and fund bicycle and pedestrian projects. A couple other things to note. There is a requirement that the competitive process in each state has this high need areas prioritization. Each state gets to choose how they do that. So that's something that a legislature could influence. And there's also a lot of match flexibility and new eligibilities around shared micromobility like electric scooters and electric bikes. So some of the takeaways for the state role is providing more bike ped staffing at state DOTs, making sure that your DOT structure supports the development and implementation of bicycle and pedestrian projects, impacting that high need areas definition and how those areas are supported, providing matching funds at the state level for these federal funds that are coming, and making sure that you have micromobility and e-bike regulations in place so that those new project eligibilities can be implemented in your state. On the Highway Safety Improvement Program, this is really all about safety. As I said, it is something that hasn't been well used for bicycle and pedestrian safety in the past. So Congress decided to create a vulnerable road user safety special rule where states that have 15% or more of their fatalities being people who were biking and walking when they were killed have to spend 15% or more of Highway Safety Improvement Program funding on bicycle and pedestrian projects. So this map is a map that I created. It may or may not be absolutely correct. Your state DOT should have been notified if they have to comply with this rule this spring. It's an annual determination, so it changes every year. One of the things we know, looking at data that is available from NHTSA, is that people biking are killed on state-owned roadways. In basically every state, a higher percentage of people killed on bikes are killed on state-owned roadways than there are state-owned roadways. So we know these state-owned roadways are some of the most dangerous places to bike, and we see it in the data in basically every state. So Highway Safety Improvement Program says that the projects that need to be done here are projects that separate users in time and space, match vehicle speeds to the built environment, and increase visibility, and that is all part of a safe system approach. So the state has a clear role in reducing bicyclists and pedestrian fatalities because we know that state DOT-owned roads are where fatalities are happening most often. The bipartisan infrastructure law also included new project types So some of those are separated bike lanes, separated intersections, bicycle and pedestrian signals. It also created this specified safety project type, which is more like multidisciplinary. So, it allows your DOT to partner with others, take a more comprehensive approach to safety. And if you're looking to improve bicycle and pedestrian safety, the planning process for HSIP has this whole emphasis area development and strategy development. Sometimes state legislatures are very involved in that. There are like committees that are created by the legislature or involve the legislature in the development of these emphasis areas. In our bicycle friendly state program, we found that 35 states have a bicycle safety emphasis area. We also found that engineering as a strategy for safety is less common than education. And you really need that engineering strategy to logically flow to engineering improvements that are funded by the HSIP program. So it would be great to see more states have that engineering strategy under their emphasis area. And that would really help make sure that we have a logical and consistent approach to bicycle and pedestrian safety. Next year, there will be guidance around this thing called a vulnerable road user safety assessment. It needs to be done within 2 years of the passage of the bill. It's probably a really great place for the legislature to get involved and have an impact and reach constituents. But you'll learn more about that probably next year or later this fall. So just reviewing, you need to make sure that newer, safer facilities are legal in your state. I know like a state like California, a couple of years back adopted a bill making sure that separated bike lanes were legal. There may be other states where you need to take action like that. Pennsylvania has had issues with whether or not parking protected bike lanes are legal. So as a first thing, make sure that safer infrastructure is legal in your state. You can do things like adopt a Vision Zero resolution or other support for zero traffic deaths as a goal, as we see in our national roadway safety strategy. Look out for that vulnerable road user safety assessment process. I think that's going to be a really great opportunity to engage communities around vulnerable road user safety and agencies. Get involved in that strategic highway safety plan development process to make sure that people are getting to the table. And review speed limit related laws and policies. That's really one of the core pillars of the safe system approach, is focusing on safer speeds. So hopefully we're going to see that through HSIP implementation. Just a quick note here, the bipartisan infrastructure law, federal legislature is requiring that states use 2.5% of their planning funds on complete streets activities. Not every state has a complete streets law, policy, or resolution. If your state doesn't have one of those, it still will need to comply with this law. But if you've been holding back on doing a complete streets law or policy or resolution, now's a great time to do it because there's guaranteed funding for it. Just a few more things. The highway safety grants, these are NHTSA grants. They pay for traffic law enforcement, education, community engagement. They got increases like basically everything else in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So it's a good time to pay attention to that. On our priority, non-motorized safety, we have this little program under 405, which is the national priority safety programs. We got more funding. We also got a change in eligibility so it can fund demonstration projects on the benefits of infrastructure. And for me, this is really exciting. There's research published by Bloomberg saying that when you do these kind of like art installations that are temporary and demonstrate how infrastructure can change, you can really reduce bicyclist pedestrian crashes. Their study found 50%. And this map shows the states that have been eligible for these grants in the past. Again, it has that 15% of fatalities being people who bike or walk as the eligibility. And one of the last things here that I'll touch on is racial profiling prohibition grants. The NCSL has this traffic stop data product that kind of shows where states require data collection on traffic stops. The map that I put underneath is states that have received this racial profiling prohibition grant. And that's a lot fewer states than states that require traffic stop data collection. So if you're needing a little bit of help to fund the analysis of that and program around that, this grant program can help. And there's been changes to provide technical assistance to really make sure that more states are accessing this and making progress, reducing racial disparities in traffic stops. So just to review, check your state laws, make sure they reflect best practices, work with your governor on that highway safety grant program implementation. We need more community engagement in those grants. Look for these traffic safety demonstration projects coming in a little bit, especially around pedestrian and bicyclist safety. And then make sure that you have laws in place to understand what's happening at traffic stops and reduce disparities in stops, tickets, and arrests. Those grants do exist in the Racial Profiling Prohibition Grant Program, and we really hope more states are going to go after that. And yeah, hopefully I hit my time.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate it for taking that alphabet soup of new and existing but refined programs and kind of explaining what that all means. There's certainly a lot of significant opportunities in the BIL that states should be aware of. I did have a question. Can you mention the requirement around if a state has more than 15% of their fatalities is that bicyclists and pedestrians and like wheelchair users and those kind of users as well? Correct?
It specifies in the guidance. I don't remember offhand how broad it is.
Gotcha.
It uses NHTSA FARS data, which has a couple different ways that they identify people who are bicyclists, pedestrians, persons on personal conveyances, which there's a motorized and a non-motorized version there. Because if you have a wheelchair, it can be motorized or non-motorized. But it's defined in the guidance that has come out. Okay. And it should be communicated to all state DOTs by now, and it will be communicated on an annual basis. It's an annual determination, so it'll change year to year whether your state has to spend that money in that way.
Yeah, thanks for revisiting that. And so, yeah, folks are interested in that, maybe connecting with your state DOT legislative liaison to find out where your state sits on that. I wanted to ask about something related, Ken. You had mentioned that the kind of fatality rate is higher on state-owned roads compared to local roads, locally operated roads. Do you maybe have a sense or any research or data pointing? I have some guesses as to why that would be, but do you have a sense or any data showing why that is the case?
I think it's most likely that it just is that state DOT owned roads tend to be more multi-lane roads, higher speed limits, and have that greater potential for danger because they have higher traffic volumes and higher speeds. The thing we're always missing when we talk about biking and walking is how many people are biking and walking and where are they doing it. So we don't have rates of like bicyclist deaths per bicycle miles traveled, because states and the federal government just haven't required that data collection and set up systems to report that data.
Understood. Yeah, and that's something might be interesting to revisit with our next panelist, Barb, because they might have a little bit of a sense of that. So let's see what she has to say. So thank you for your presentation, Ken. Barb, I'll re-pull up the presentation now, and you will just have to let me know when your slides are up next. So Ken, we'll come back to you for some questions. Jesse, I saw that you asked a question. Let's wait till the end because I think Barb would be well equipped to answer that as well. So let's wait for that. So next up, we have Barb Chamberlain, who has served as director of the Active Transportation Division at the Washington State Department of Transportation since it was created in March of 2017. And I've known Barb kind of before that and worked with her for a while and tracked what's been going on with Washington, this new Active Transportation Division, which is a little bit of a trend. There's a few states that have such divisions or something like that. So that's maybe a best practice in of itself. She leads policy planning and capacity building for walking, rolling, and other forms of accessible and equitable active transportation. She serves on the AASHTO Council on Active Transportation and Equity Task Force and the Washington State Cooper Jones Active Transportation Safety Council, which was created by the legislature. And I think she's going to talk about a little bit. The Washington legislature is taking a number of actions to increase vulnerable user safety in the last 4 or 5 years, particularly including new laws, new funding streams, et cetera. So with that, Barb's going to give us kind of an overview of the program and what kind of, and I would regard Washington as being kind of a leader in a lot of this. So thanks so much for joining us today. And let me just quickly reshare my screen and pull up the presentation and get us to where we need to be, Barb, and then we should be ready to go.
All right, sure thing. And an audio check just to make sure you hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you good. And sorry, let me just get you to your slides. Give me 1 second. And that's the first
There you
one.
go. Right.
There you go. Thank you.
Yep. All right. And thanks so much for inviting me to join you. Not included in my bio, but just so you know, many years ago, I actually served in the Idaho State Legislature and considered NCSL a real resource. So happy to be part of this today. And Ken is another valuable resource. I'm happy to be one as well, either through questions in the chat or my email and Twitter account are both included in the slide. So follow up anytime if you have questions. I'm going to provide just a bit of context on our work and then run through some of the recent legislative actions. And our starting point really is to know that in the states and nationally, the move is toward integrated multimodal roadways that are improving safety for all. With that, I'll take us to the next slide with Doug's help and share a statement that's from our active transportation plan. So Doug, if you want to roll one forward. This is a statement that's in our state plan that was published last December. And the thing I want to note is it doesn't say the active transportation future. It says the integrated transportation system of the future. And that's important context because all of us are pedestrians at some point in the journey. And our plan really emphasizes that idea that this is, yes, it's focused on active transportation facilities and engineering needs and safety, but that really is for all of us. And as you think about the policy you want to make for your state, you're interested in improving safety for everyone. When you improve it for pedestrians in particular, you reduce the frequency, you reduce the severity of crashes, you improve safety for everybody, including making it work better for drivers because they get the information they need to make good decisions in time. The next slide lists examples of some of the kinds of resources we developed as a state, and your state likely has similar things. The first is the Strategic Highway Safety Plan, and Washington was the first state in the nation to set a really aspirational goal of 0 traffic deaths. We still have that goal. The trend line is not going the right direction, but I believe we have more and more tools, more knowledge about what works, and we don't want to double down on things that haven't worked. We want to move forward. The active transportation plan, in our case, has a lot of methodology around how we really looked at state routes themselves. Surprise, not built for active transportation. And so what needs to change to make them work better for all users? And finally, that Active Transportation Safety Council created by the legislature. These and other reports and plans and analysis all really keep pointing back to the same issues. One is equity. The next is engineering safety by design and the safe system approach. And that also shows up in the IIJA, as Ken mentioned. And then thinking in terms of capacity building and partnerships, that the problems do not start or stop at the city limits. And I don't know that you've ever driven out of a city and seen a sign that said the driving lane ends, but I sure get to see those if I'm on my bike. So thinking about it as a partnership approach. The next slide shares a couple of graphics just to sort of bring home the meaning of the safe system approach. The left-hand side shows you the hierarchy of controls. And that idea is borrowed from workplace safety, that you want to eliminate the exposure in the first place. Think about toxins in the workplace, all the way down to the least effective line of defense, last line of defense, and that's personal protective equipment. And traffic safety has focused a lot on that teeny tiny spot at the bottom. Wear a bike helmet and things will be fine. And the bike helmet did not prevent a crash I was in when I broke my elbow. So you want to eliminate the chance of the crash happening if you can. That's just a smarter use of the money because it's going to reduce the problems for everybody. The little shocker guy on the right-hand side around the light switch is a reminder that for things like clean water and electricity, we engineer safety into the system. It's not at the last point. I don't have to put special gloves on to touch the light switch in my house. The power coming out of our hydro dams in Washington has been stepped down to a manageable level for me to interact with it as an individual. So safety policy at the broadest level is most effective, and it costs society the least over the long run. So if we go to the next slide, this is information our secretary has been sharing to just point out what are the costs of the transportation system to us as taxpayers. And safety is far and away the greatest cost to Washingtonians. Safety and preservation and environmental impacts are all higher costs than congestion. And I'll drop a link into the chat after I'm done with my slides to show you how we calculated the information on the next slide. If you took that cost of safety and you said, instead of spreading it across the system at hospitals and lost productivity at work and the effects on my family and all of those things, and if instead you turned it into a gas tax and we paid it at the pump, then the cost of safety to Washingtonians would be $4.73 a gallon. And we don't pay that at the pump, we hide that cost, but it's a very real cost to society. With the next slide, I want to take us into a bit of what we learned from our active transportation plan, because this is really all context for the policies that our legislature has been enacting the last few years and our work as an agency. Pedestrians and bicyclists in Washington are now 22% of all our traffic deaths, and Ken noted similar numbers out of proportion to mode share or miles traveled. When we did an analysis by place of where the serious and fatal crashes are occurring, what we see is a really strong pattern in places with higher rates of poverty, higher rates of residents who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So we cannot achieve the goal of zero traffic deaths unless we address active transportation, because those are out of proportion. And we can't address active transportation safety without addressing equity. And that shows up in the policies that we've been adopting. I will also note that these locations are often the same places that have wide, fast, busy roads. They were chosen in some instances to be the location that the highway cut through. And these are the locations with people who are most reliant on active transportation and transit access. With that, I want to go to the next slide and start talking about some of the policies. I'm going to sort of fly through these and not dig into details. We can get into those in the questions as you identify which ones are of most interest. Safety over speed, which is in fact even a hashtag. We had a law pass a few years ago saying cities could lower the speed limit without doing an engineering or traffic study. If you think about it, we set higher speed limits on freeways as a policy matter. We said you want to get people moving quickly between towns. Speed limits in town could also be set as a policy matter, and then engineering enacts policy instead of the other way around. The legislature came back this year and extended that option to counties and to WashDOT. In between there, our agency put out a policy framework, and that's available for anybody to look at to think about how would you set speeds based on what you want. What's the mix of users? So far, Seattle's the only city that's really taken up the lower speed limits, but even just putting up more frequent signage has helped bring down the average speeds. The next set of laws sort of grouped together are around safer passing and the safety stop, which is what it was called in our state. You may know it as the Idaho stop, the Colorado stop, the Delaware stop, whichever state you're from. We updated our safe passing law to require drivers to move over more and extended the due care standard that applied to drivers to also apply to pedestrians, because there was actually a higher standard in the law for pedestrians. The next category is around automated enforcement or safety cameras, and that's on the next slide. We had one pass that's about blocking the box, meaning the crosswalk or the restricted lane, and another just expanding use of safety cameras into more locations. I need to really put a pin in the equity note on use of automated cameras, that if you say, well, we have a lot of crashes and speeding in these places, let's put up those cameras there, you're putting up in the places that were originally disadvantaged by the designs and the types of roads that were put there. So you will end up with disproportionate ticketing in lower income neighborhoods. So having an equity analysis is one of the pieces that our legislature included when they expanded that. Another category of legislation you might have thought about or enacted or be looking at is around anything to do with new mobility. And so we've updated our e-bike laws. If you want some fan notes about e-bikes, I will tell you all about my class 1. And we have a regulatory framework for e-scooter or scooter share kinds of things, and authorize the use of the personal delivery devices that use the sidewalk, and which can create some concerns around ADA accessibility. So be thinking about wider sidewalks as an answer for all of us. And the final category is a very full slide. That is the recent enactment of Move Ahead Washington, which heavily invests in safety, active transportation, and transit using climate emission reduction funds. Equity and safety are embedded in every new or expanded program. And so for us, it triples. If we compare baseline 2020 to baseline 2022, it triples our funding for Safe Routes to School and our pedestrian bicyclist program. It starts a new pilot program to look at places where state facilities disrupted the active transportation network. And a particular note on that one is those funds can go to anything from planning through construction. And that's really, really helpful because cities are at different stages of development in what they have and whether or not they know the right solution. So thinking about dollars that can go to what needs to happen that doesn't have necessarily a predetermined use is really, really important for local agencies in the state. Spans our bike education. A big one for us is really enhancing the design directive to us as an agency for Complete Streets work. And we'll have a lot of studies coming out that may have useful information for you on things like non-drivers, who are about 25% of our population, and possibly the same for you. And with that, looking forward to answering your questions. I will also let you know we put out an e-news anybody's welcome to subscribe to, and I will drop a link to that in the chat too. And Doug, that's it.
Barb, can you unshare your screen? Or sorry, I have it. I'm sharing it, right? Oh,
yeah, I was going to say, yikes, did you see all my speaker notes for all that?
Oh boy, no, you didn't. Okay, I appreciate that, Barb. You gave a great overview of the really impressive actions that are being taken in Washington and the commitment that has been shown over numerous years and numerous legislative sessions. So thanks for sharing it. I just want to touch on a couple of things that you mentioned that have been done in Washington that have been also kind of trends throughout the country. You mentioned that states that the legislature allowed localities sort of to lower speed limits, and that Seattle in particular has taken advantage of that. Our research at NCSL, I believe, has that there's been, I think, 12 states in the last 5 years that have given some level of more control or flexibility to local governments to lower speed limits in certain instances. And a lot of that is focused around the kind of focusing on in-town kind of areas, business districts, residential areas where there's more bike and pedestrian traffic. So that's definitely, we're seeing a lot of action on that. And we do have resources and all these things I'm going to mention. Some of them aren't on our website. They're in our kind of memo folder. So reach out if you're interested. Barb mentioned the safety stop law, and I'll be interested if we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Colorado just became the 9th state to legalize a safety stop. And a safety stop essentially means a stop sign is a yield sign for a bicyclist, and acknowledging the kind of differences with a bike in terms of stopping speed, but also the need to keep going, and also to just get through an intersection to reduce, because a lot of crashes do take place in intersections. I will note that some of those laws allow bicyclists to go through stoplights after treating as a stop sign, but that is not the case in all of the states. So the laws do differ between the 9 states a little bit. And Barb mentioned the safe passing laws. There are now 35 states that require at least 3 feet or more when a motorist is passing a bicyclist. And 5 states, I believe, have laws requiring a motorist to completely change lanes when passing a bicyclist if a lane is available. I think you're one of those states. Is that right, Barb?
Yeah.
Okay, good. My memory's okay. And then you mentioned e-scooters and e-bikes. And obviously, I think a lot of folks are seeing what's going on with that, with rentable fleets, but also people using their own personal ones. So a lot of states have been creating the kind of the definitions and regulatory frameworks for those types of vehicles. So I just want to mention that. So a lot of stuff going on in Washington. I thought it was really notable, the amount of money that the Washington legislature created for new transportation projects this year, and the fact that so much of it was devoted to active transportation and safety in general. And Ken, thanks for posting your bike law resources there. Those are a great read. I always use those. So we do have a question that goes to one of the points you were making, Barb. This comes from Jesse Phage. Asks, what suggestions do you have for areas where bikes are restricted from using the sidewalk, such as a business district, but they're not convenient alternatives? The second part of the question is kind of related. What can we do about bike lanes, and you referenced this, Barb, that are abruptly end at major intersections so that bikers are forced into traffic? So the first question is, what do you do where there's an area, in a lot of instances, bikes can't use the sidewalk? So what are some options in that case? And then, how do you kind of avoid these circumstances where a bike lane abruptly ends? So I'm interested in Ken and Barb, both of your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll put a link in the chat, but NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, has a great document called "Don't Give Up at the Intersection," particularly addressing that issue of bike lanes ending at intersections. Kind of the design guidance that has been out there for a long time from groups like AASHTO has kind of just said, as you're approaching an intersection where there may be conflicts with a bike lane, let the bike lane end. And we're seeing more and more guidance saying we need more continuous support for people biking through intersections and making sure that we're reducing conflicts with infrastructure through intersections rather than just stopping the bike lane beforehand. So I'll throw that in the chat.
Appreciate that, Ken. I think we may have had Barb drop off. I don't see her on here now, so let's hope that we can get her back on. If Annie, or if you could possibly check and see what's going on there. She may just have lost connectivity, but we have some other questions here. Ken, a vulnerable, and I know you've looked at, did you have something to add, Ken?
Yeah, I was just going to add on the sidewalk piece. You know, if you are able to slow down the street so that it's, you know, 20 miles per hour, 25 miles per hour, even if you don't have space to put in a bike facility, more people who bike are going to be comfortable using that space and mixing with cars if it's a lower speed street. And also, I would generally say state sidewalk riding laws could use a lot more work. Not every state has them. Often there's a lot of deference to locally created prohibitions on sidewalk riding, which doesn't really provide a framework for people who might feel like a sidewalk is the only place they can safely ride to understand their rights and responsibilities towards people walking or motorists. So I think there's a lot of action that state legislatures can do to more clearly define the rights of bicyclists, scooter users, pedestrians, as they're mixing in those spaces, because we know it happens. And in too many states, there's just a prohibition and there's no guidance on how you're supposed to behave.
Fair enough. Thank you for that, Ken. Yeah, those sidewalk operation laws do differ quite a bit or don't have much detail in general. I see Barb is back on. Let's ask another question. A vulnerable road user can take on an array of meanings. To name just a few, it includes pedestrians, micro mobility users, bicyclists, emergency response personnel, highway construction workers, people riding and horses. What should states be looking at when it comes to addressing the needs of vulnerable road users, or kind of defining that in law, I guess?
Thanks, and apologies, I do not know what happened to my system. You all froze and vanished.
No worries, Barb.
Happy to be back. I think there's several things, and some of them are engineering solutions. And so I guess the question is, does your policy support the use of the engineering solutions? I think always of space, roadway that provides space for all of the functions. And roads do more than just carry people back and forth. So you have space to adjust and leave room and space for an exit strategy. So a bridge here, a bicyclist on a bridge, there's nowhere to go.
Hey, Barb, you have something blocking your camera right now. I don't know.
That would be my cat.
Go ahead.
He loves participating in meetings. So he may jump back in. Separation and speed are a couple of other, again, engineering elements, but what's in policy that enables you to have those safety factors. And I think I mentioned the safe passing law. Ours is similar to the slow down and move over law for work zone and law enforcement, things like that. Just anybody who is not moving as fast, that's an issue. And a final point I think maybe doesn't come up as often is lighting. Can the drivers see the road? And if you think pedestrians are sort of appearing out of nowhere, they're actually in a very dark somewhere before the driver sees them. And so what's out there to support doing good lighting?
which is, I think, an overlooked element. There's a new book out on outdoor lighting for pedestrians. So again, more engineering than not, but what does policy do to let you do what needs to be done on those things? And I will start calling Tiggs Policy Cat. Thank you.
Ken, anything to add to that?
I mean, I would second all of that. When we've consulted around vulnerable road user laws, we always tell people to go for an expansive definition. Think of everyone who is a vulnerable road user and their needs. I think it's important that state legislatures can adopt complete streets laws that require the consideration of vulnerable road users, and that can, be consideration, or that can have more prescriptive standards about how they're accommodated, how facilities are built for their needs, considering all those issues of lighting, space, and speed and separation. And I think in that conversation, it's also really important to think about disability and accessibility, and making sure that people with disabilities are accommodated when we're thinking about vulnerable road users. They are some of our most vulnerable. So that's an important thing to think about.
Thank you. Let's take, I want to ask another question. Can you all discuss a little bit? I was going to ask about kind of what states' tangible steps they can take to help create safer infrastructure. I think you've already touched on a good amount of that. Complete streets, putting the requisite funding, giving them space, lighting, a lot of good examples. A lot of that theoretically can lead to an increase in people biking and walking. And there are instances where I know that's proven out from certain cities or geographical settings. Can you all maybe discuss the concept of safety in numbers, which was kind of this accepted theory that you create conditions that lead to more bicyclists and walkers, and that leads to more safe conditions, in part because the motorist awareness of that of those folks is higher. But I've seen recently maybe a little bit of a commentary kind of pushing back on that notion a little bit. So I'm wondering what your guys' thoughts are on that and how important that is, how that's important, but you maybe need to be cautious about just thinking more bicyclists and pedestrians is going to solve everything, I suppose. So thoughts on that?
Want to run with that first?
Yeah, I'll run with that by sharing an anecdote that a transportation engineer said to me one time when I was visiting a city, and the city was about to get bike share, and he's like, "This is great. We're going to have bike share out. We're going to have people who don't bike regularly just wandering over all of our traffic lanes, and we're going to have slower speeds because of that." And that's not the correct interpretation of safety in numbers, like just throwing people into a bad environment and hoping that it works out. I think safety in numbers is in part people becoming more familiar with other road users and their behaviors, and so they're more conscious of that and they know how to react better. But safety in numbers also comes from investing in safe infrastructure and people being more likely to bike and walk because they feel safe. So I think it definitely requires both, and just adding a lot more people to the street in a vulnerable position, it isn't the way to approach safety in numbers.
Yeah, and I'll add a couple of thoughts. One is that we emphasize user counts one way or the other because we're used to that from the vehicle model. And we built complete networks for drivers, so now we can count them in the boxes. We don't have complete networks for walking or biking. And so if we think first about complete networks that are comfortable for all users, that's where the numbers will come from. And that's also where the safety gets enhanced because you're reducing crash exposure. Another element of the safety in numbers piece, I think I've seen at work in places that have higher rates of folks who walk or bike. That means when you get behind the wheel, you've had that direct experience. You are a better driver if you walk or bike. You are much more aware. You're looking both ways, even when you're turning onto a one-way street, those kinds of things. And I think an interesting policy arena to explore would be to take the concept of driver's ed and expand it and call it mobility education. And I'm really excited that we're going to be doing more and more broadly available bike safety education, which will start with pedestrian safety for the littlest ones. They need those concepts. So you learn to walk safely, learn the rules of the road, learn to bike safely. Do you learn how to use transit? And then when you get behind the wheel, you've had all those experiences. And I don't think there's any state in the nation doing that kind of work. And that would be, I think, a huge change. So it's not quite safety in numbers, it's more like safety in personal experience that you bring to it.
Thank you. Those are insightful answers. Yeah, the idea of kind of reshaping what driver's ed looks like, it's certainly something that states have like, there has been some actions to include more kind of awareness and being taught specifically about bicyclists and pedestrian safety law, but it seems like there's some further improvements that can be made there. Thanks for just giving that's interesting to think about, just discuss that concept of safety in numbers. I want to ask a question about, bicyclist and pedestrian and not vulnerable user safety is a difficult nut to crack, because they are vulnerable. That's in the they're vulnerable. They're not in something that's protecting them, and a lot of the things that impact their safety are just kind of holistic traffic safety challenges, right? So we're talking about distracted driving, impaired driving, speeding. These are all threats to the safety of vulnerable road users. So is there something states can maybe consider doing that is addressing some of those larger scale traffic safety challenges, that is also being maybe specific about thinking about them in the context of vulnerable user safety, or any kind of insight to share about how a state should maybe tackle some of those to make sure that you're getting the kind of results you want to drive down the number of pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities? Thoughts on that?
I'll start with a comment that I've actually wasn't hearing until somewhat recently, but I've heard people in the bicycle and pedestrian community recently push back on vulnerable, because it is not an issue with us being vulnerable. It is an issue with drivers and motor vehicles being deadly. So we are not inherently vulnerable. We are humans. So we're vulnerable in the same sense everyone is, but drivers in motor vehicles going a certain speed are deadly to people. So I think we do need to think broadly about making sure that our transportation system supports people moving around without killing each other. And so that means a focus on lower speeds. That means a focus on providing options for transit or biking and walking, or other modes of transportation like scooters, etc. And I think specifically, we need to be making investments that provide those alternative transportation systems, not just a nice path in the park, but making sure that we are addressing speed on the roadway with safe infrastructure for people biking and walking at the same time on the same places, because those are often state-owned roads that are the fastest roads with potentially the worst facilities for people biking and walking. There's kind of a win-win for safety if we can slow the speed and provide better spaces for people biking and walking there.
I really love that reframing of it, Ken. And another element makes me think back to that safety in numbers question, more people walking and biking. Well, one of the proven safety countermeasures in the Highway Safety Manual is reducing vehicle miles traveled. If I'm not driving a vehicle, I can't hit anyone with it. And that sounds possibly over dramatic, and I do drive, not very often, but really, what are we doing to look, and this is not always a state level issue, what are we doing at the national level to talk about vehicle design and the effects that has on the people outside the vehicle? And we are not doing what could be done to regulate vehicle design, to make use of speed governors and other elements that really would reshape the human behavior inside the box and help the folks outside the box as well.
Yeah, and thanks for Barb for highlighting kind of, and you've done this kind of throughout your presentation, the fact that a lot of this achieving traffic safety, better traffic safety outcomes for bicyclists and pedestrians is tied up with other kind of transportation and larger policy goals around greenhouse gas emission reduction and what have you. So There are a lot of connections to think about there that are connected to safety. Yeah, and then to your piece, there's obviously a lot of commentary about vehicle design at the moment. Obviously, there's not much the states, not really anything the states can do in that regard, but that's something to kind of keep an eye on. We did get another question through the chat from Jill Shelley. A lot of legislators are older than the average cyclist and don't see the need for spending on additional protections. What arguments get through? So I guess really the question is like, what arguments resonate to get more actual funding for enhanced bicyclist infrastructure? In your guys' estimation, what's been successful there?
I'll take a bit of a run at it. I go back to what I said early on, that this is for everybody. It's not just for quote unquote the vulnerable road users, that you are a pedestrian when you get out of your car. And did you want to cross to your favorite restaurant over there? Then you need to be able to cross safely. Information for drivers that's conveyed through engineering and operations is another thing that has seemed to resonate. And I guess in response to the last question too, I'll say, I'd love for us to have absolutely safe vehicles and humans who behave perfectly all the time, and we don't have either of those things. So I go to engineering. And so the engineering does help everybody, and pointing out that it helps everybody, I think, is important. This is also a personal experience that you're all going to go through. If you haven't already had to take the keys away from an older parent, have fun with that. People will age out of being able to drive safely, and AAA uses the term your driving retirement years. So what are you going to do? And thinking about how they maintain transportation independence through walking and biking and transit, that will still be very possible for a lot of older folks who just don't have the reflexes to move at 30 or 40 or 50 miles an hour, but they're great at 5 or 10.
And I'll just kind of follow up on the whole idea older than the average cyclist. You know, in 2009, 162 bicyclists age 55 or older were killed in traffic. In 2019, that more than doubled to 365. You know, in about a generation, bicyclists went from having the lowest average age of all road users to the highest average age of all road users killed. So there are many people who are older adults who bike a lot, and they are bearing the brunt of the rise in bicyclist fatalities. So, you know, I'm not going to speak to exactly what the average age of a cyclist is, but there are a lot of older adults who are bicycling, and unfortunately, way too many of them are being killed.
Thank you for that.
Get them on an e-bike and let them experience an e-bike. It is a game changer. Oh my God, flattens the hills. And people will ride farther on an e-bike much more easily. It's easier than walking. So that's another thing that does get through.
Yeah, that's a good point, Barb. The fact that we're seeing this adoption of e-bikes in some states and some municipalities now offering incentives, once again, with an eye towards emission reduction to try and get people to purchase e-bikes. They're doing that in the city of Denver where I am. And I've thought about buying an e-bike if they're going to give me some money to do that. And the purpose of that is, you know, to help incentivize people to take shorter trips or extend out their comfort level with how far they'll travel on a bike. So unfortunately, we are at time. This was a great discussion. I'm really just pleased that Barb, you and Ken were both able to participate. And as I expected, you both did a great job and you have so much expertise to share. I wanted to thank all the attendees for participating. As a reminder, a recording will be made available and we will share that when we have that ready. So just hold tight for that. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, June 2nd, exploring school bus electrification. To register or find out more information, please visit ncsl.org or send Kristen Hildreth an email. And thank you for your continued interest and support of NCSL. Please do reach out if you want to participate in that traffic safety pre-conference that will be taking place in Denver on July 31st. We'll be certainly talking about vulnerable road user safety and many other topics, including railroad crossing safety, autonomous vehicles, automated enforcement, drug impaired driving, etc. So thanks again to Barb and Ken. Let's all give them a virtual round of applause. And we will see all of you again. And please don't hesitate to reach out. Have a great day.
Thanks, Doug.